Russell Raymond is an aristocrat from a fallen noble family. Now he spends his days as a mercenary after losing his family name and his last hope of restoring their former glory. These days he wanders around taking mercenary jobs just to earn enough to survive. His latest search for work brings him back to the kingdom's capital, known as Camelot. It's not called the capital for nothing. This is where the Tower of Magic stands, home to the kingdom's most powerful guardians. Once Russell had also worked hard to make his way into that tower, hoping to stop his family's downfall. You see, after his father died in the war against the Empire, his family was forced to flee their castle. Russell had to enter the Tower of Magic to reclaim their lands. And in the process, he was separated from his mother when he was very young. All the sacrifices he made were in vain because he was expelled from the academy before he even got the chance to apply to the tower. He had failed 3 grades, and according to the dean, this was the first time in the academy's entire history. Although his theoretical performance was good, the problem was that he couldn't reach the second circle of magic. The reason he couldn't advance was due to a condition called mana vein narrowing. Apparently, his mana veins were thin and weak, which meant he could only absorb a limited amount of mana. On top of that, he couldn't release any of it. One of the worst curses that could ever befall a mage. So, Russell ended up living his life as a mercenary. Even though his experience in mercenary work helped him reach the second circle, he was still considered a third-ass mage. Suddenly, the gates of the White Tower opened, and an employee announced that today's registration for temporary jobs had ended. Everyone would have to come back tomorrow. The people who had been waiting outside for half the day were frustrated to hear this. But since they had no other choice, they decided to leave. Meanwhile, Russell sat quietly listening to what the others were saying. Someone mentioned a rumor that the museum was hiring temporary mages, but another person objected, saying they were only looking for first circle mages for some lowly task, and that working there would be embarrassing. But Russell didn't see it that way, especially since he barely had any money left. Later he arrived at the famous Louvre Museum. Inside he followed the museum owner who was introducing the place to all the newly hired workers, including Russell. The owner explained that many aristocrats would be visiting this week, so everything had to be perfectly clean. He warned them to be careful while cleaning because if they caused any damage, they'd have to face the consequences. As they walked through the hallway decorated with artifacts that might have been completely fake, Russell suddenly noticed a locked door that looked strangely familiar. The plaque read, "Room of Mythical Species." A strange feeling stirred at the back of his mind. He was sure he'd seen this place before. At that very moment, his mother's ring began to tremble for some mysterious reason. He stared at the door for a while, and before he realized it, his body started moving on its own. He opened the door and stepped inside. Once he entered, the trembling grew stronger. Russell closed his eyes, trying to listen to whatever his mother was trying to tell him. His mind drifted back to the past, to a time when he'd visited this place with her. He remembered an unexplored part of the museum he'd never gotten a chance to visit. After thinking for a moment, he walked toward that section. There, he found something extraordinary. The ancient heart of a dragon displayed separately from the other artifacts. At the same time, the ring's vibrations intensified. Russell noticed the connection between the 2 artifacts. The ring shaped like a dragon's eye, and the object before him, a dragon's heart. He quickly slipped the ring onto his finger, and the trembling gradually stopped. But after a brief pause, the ring began to crackle with a strange power, and a voice echoed inside his mind. The voice told him that since the eye and the heart had met, another eye had opened. A massive dragon loomed above Russell within his mind, revealing that he was destined to become the cornerstone of a new legend. For that reason, Russell was granted another chance this time for the sake of the legend itself. As the voice faded, his system awakened, and everything around him twisted in an instant. He had returned to the past. He could faintly hear his teacher shouting at him in anger, followed by the loud thud of a book hitting his head. He suddenly snapped back to his senses as the teacher scolded him for sleeping in class. Of course, Russell had no idea what on earth was happening or why Professor Hubert was suddenly yelling at him. After all, as far as he remembered, Hubert was already dead. He looked around curiously, glancing left and right at the students, then at himself. It didn't take long for him to realize that somehow he had been sent back in time. Meanwhile, Hubert kicked him out of class as punishment. Still, Russell had no clue what kind of magic could have caused this. Now that he thought about it, he was sure it must have been the dragon's doing. Then he noticed that his ring was missing, making him wonder for a moment whether his mother had something to do with this. Right then, the teacher stepped out of the classroom. Even though Russell apologized for his mistake, the teacher wasn't satisfied and called him into the office for a private meeting. Though Russell was in trouble, he actually found himself enjoying the feeling. But soon after, he got a sharp slap on the back of his head. It was, of course, a group of typical bullies ready to stir up trouble with him. One of them, a blonde-haired boy, decided to slap Russell too, but his friend stopped him since the teachers were watching. Russell recognized the blonde boy as Coma Frederick. Frederick shot him a deadly glare and ordered him to follow them to the bathroom if he valued his life. With that, they walked away, while Russell actually felt delighted to finally get a chance to relive all of this. Suddenly, his notification system urged him to give those bullies a harsh lesson, promising him a magic stone as a reward. Russell wasn't sure what kind of illusion this was, but before he could figure it out, Frederick called out again, telling him to either follow or try to run. Either way, they didn't care, since they were clearly asking for it. Russell made up his mind to teach them a lesson before doing anything else. After years of living as a mercenary, the threats and glares from Frederick were nothing compared to the terror he'd felt facing monsters. Compared to that, these boys were like cuddly little teddy bears. Anyway, once they entered the bathroom, Frederick threw a sarcastic remark at him, but Russell fired back just as sharply, calling him a bedbug bastard. The trio was stunned to see that unshakable confidence, but they hadn't come here to be insulted. The most hot-headed of them clenched his fist to punch, but Russell moved in first, delivering a devastating blow that knocked the guy unconscious. The second one, seeing his friend fall, rushed at Russell, too, but got dropped instantly by a single powerful hit. Even then, that still wasn't enough to scare Frederick. In fact, he grew even more arrogant. He tossed his smoking pipe aside and got ready to fight. He swung at Russell while mocking him, saying that since Russell couldn't use magic, he must have picked up some cheap hand-to-age hand tricks, just as expected from a ruined family. Then, Frederick slipped on 4 rings, reminding Russell that while magic was forbidden, small artifacts were allowed. With that, he lunged forward, but Russell caught his incoming fist, twisted his wrist, and watched as Frederick's knees buckled in pain. That cold look in Russell's eyes shook him to the core. Russell was furious that someone like Frederick dared to even mention his family name. With one last punch, he settled the score. After finishing the lesson he promised those bullies, Russell left the bathroom and sat against the wall on the floor, wondering if maybe he went a bit too far. Right then, the system's notification materialized before him, rewarding him with a low-grade magic stone, just as promised. As soon as the stone appeared in his hand, the system told him to consume it. While Russell wasn't exactly sure if that meant he was supposed to literally eat it, he figured this must be another chance tied to his second shot at life. He started chewing and realized it actually tasted good. Suddenly, a red energy called mana began to swirl around his body. It soon enveloped him completely, and he panicked. The system informed him that he had absorbed the mana within the stone. Suddenly, he felt something building up his chest and got scared. Then he realized what was happening, placing his hands over his chest to steady himself. The mana he'd consumed was flowing outward, and he calmed down to let it do its work. The screen returned, notifying him that the mana inside his circle was increasing. The mana wasn't just rising, it was being absorbed into the magical circle around his heart. He stayed calm, feeling relief as it finally began to settle. A smile crept across his face. It looked like he just hit the jackpot with this new system. He could finally overcome the man of vain narrowing that had haunted him for so long. He thought about his family's downfall, his expulsion from the academy, and how, as if that weren't enough, he'd had to struggle as a third-rate mercenary. Finally, it seemed like he could change the future he once knew. He walked down the hallway with renewed joy, and everything suddenly felt brighter. Moments later, Russell knocked on Professor Hubert's door and was told to come in. He entered the room, and the old man asked him to sit down. Russell sat pretending to look gloomy, and the professor called his name in that tone only old people use when you're in trouble. Hubert told him he didn't seem himself today and started suggesting what might be wrong. He asked Russell if he was going through something difficult. The professor mentioned hearing rumors that his classmates were bullying him and wondered if that was the cause. Russell recalled his fond memories with Professor Hubert from his previous life and how the man had never abandoned him. A smile finally formed on his face as he answered, remembering he'd always wanted to say this. He told the professor there was nothing to worry about. The old man was taken aback, and Russell thanked him for asking. The professor coughed and said it was his duty as a teacher to look after his students. However, he added, Russell would still be punished for dozing off in class today. He opened a book in front of him and warned that the punishment wouldn't be easy. Russell was assigned to write an analytical report on a section of their textbook, apparently a part even senior students struggled with. As he spoke, the screen appeared again, announcing Russell's new mission, complete Professor Hubert's assignment. The system explained that he could earn extra rewards depending on the completion rate and the professor's satisfaction level. The reward, another low-grade monasterone, and something mysterious. Russell's eyes widened the moment he realized that completing assignments counted as missions, too. Professor Hubert noticed the surprise on his face and asked if the assignment was too difficult. Russell assured him it wasn't and thanked the professor. Later that day, after a few hours, he finished the report. He thought to himself that it wasn't nearly as hard as it had seemed in his previous life. Back then, he had always taken the theoretical side of magic very seriously because he'd been desperate to use mana in practice. But now there was something else he needed to focus on in this new life, something just as important as studying. That thing was called mana vein training. Russell recalled one of his mercenary jobs where he'd been running from a monster. He explained that a mana vein is the pathway through which mana flows, absorbed through breathing. The mana travels through the mana veins and gathers in the heart. In the flashback, the monster drew closer, slamming one of its massive claws into the ground, forcing Russell to leap aside to dodge the strike. As he ran, he looked back and saw the beast charging again. He explained that reversing the flow of mana outward is what people call magic. In the memory, he traced a few circles and released fire from his hands. Flames burst out, engulfing the monster. The thing is, the stronger your mana veins, the more mana you can store and the faster you can unleash it. When the flames cleared, it was obvious the monster was unharmed. His fire hadn't been strong enough to hurt it. He realized he was cooked, so he tried to form a shield to block the next attack, but before he could finish the chant, a sudden shock hit him. The monster struck him with a sucker punch of its tail. It lunged forward to finish him off. Still inside the flashback, Russell explained that his illness had made fighting monsters a complete nightmare. He lay on a rock, dazed and half unconscious. Then, suddenly, he came to. Another blow from the monster slammed him deeper into a hollow part of the stone. He wondered if the heavens were pitying his doomed fate or if it was just luck. That fall had actually dropped him into an underground area. When he got up, groaning, he looked around for a way out. Inside that hidden place, he found two grimoires filled with strange secrets. He walked toward them and picked them up. The first book was called Overvein, and the other was Wizard Body. Back in the present, Russell went out for a run to continue his mana vein training. He explained that the book called Overvein strengthens the physical body and expands the mana veins, while Wizard Body teaches exercises that replace parts of your muscle tissue with segments of mana vein. In other words, the stronger your body, the more stable your mana vein become. Russell remembered that when he'd practiced this as an adult, the change hadn't been huge. But now, since he was still growing, he'd be able to see much greater results. He trained passionately, determined to overcome his mana vein narrowing this time. Soon, the sun began to set, and he was still at it. Russell rested by a tree, admitting he couldn't go on much longer. He patted his back and told himself this was enough training for one day. Suddenly, the system screen appeared again, informing him that the quest to practice the old skill Overvein required him to run 5 kilometers, but he had only covered 0.05 so far. The reward for completing 5 kilometers would be an increase in his speed improvement rate while using the skill. Russell groaned after reading that. To motivate him, the system notified him that while practicing Overvein, he could repeat this quest once per day. It added that depending on his progress, the required distance would increase each time, and that once he reached a certain mastery level, the quest would disappear altogether. Russell frowned and asked the system, "What's the rush?" The notification almost sounded like a threat, so he decided to get moving. He reasoned that since he'd barely managed to get such a chance, he couldn't just sit still and waste it. Not long after, he pushed himself hard, covering 1.4 kilometers out of 5. Then he went even further, reaching 2.7 kilometers. At that point, his legs began to shake. It got so bad he had to stop for a break. Feeling like his knees might snap, he checked the screen and saw that he'd run 3.6 kilometers. So, he comforted himself. Almost done. He decided to give it one last push with all the strength he had left. He ran like a madman to reach the goal. Late at night, the notification finally appeared he had completed the quest and earned his rewards. He collapsed to the ground, feeling like he'd die if he took one more step. Despite the exhaustion, the sense of achievement made him smile. He wondered how on earth he'd make it back to the dorm. The next morning, Professor Hubert reviewed Russell's report and couldn't believe his eyes, it was that detailed. He looked at Russell and asked if he was sure he'd written it himself. Russell smirked confidently and confirmed that he had. The professor noticed the newfound confidence in his eyes. Finally, Hubert spoke, saying he was very pleased with the report. Suddenly, the system screen appeared again, informing him that the mission was complete and the rewards were ready. His rewards were another low-grade Manhwa and an extra gem of the same size. He also received enhanced understanding of the art of summoning beasts. And thanks to that deeper understanding, he gained a boost in power and reduced mana consumption and a decrease in spellcasting time. Russell realizes that the higher his level of understanding grows, the stronger he becomes, and he quickly decides to make use of it. The professor praises his work and tells him he can leave now. But before leaving, Russell decides to ask the professor for a favor. Moments later, after Russell's request, the professor asks why he wants to use the faculty library. The man points out that the student library should have more than enough books to meet his needs. Russell tells him that he's already read every single book in the student library. That sounds unbelievable. So the professor asks if he really has read them all, and Russell confirms it. The professor admits that it's shocking to hear that, but even if it's true, granting access to the faculty library is an entirely different matter. He tells Russell he'll test him first to see if he's qualified. Russell's face lights up, and he agrees, saying that's completely understandable. Soon after, multiple mission windows pop up, each requesting Russell to complete one of the professor's assignments in exchange for rewards. While running outside later, he thinks about how many assignments the professor has given him and concludes that the man is hard to please. But since deeper theoretical understanding makes one's magic stronger, Russell decides it's worth it. He's determined to gain access to the faculty library's advanced knowledge at any cost. Besides, he'll also earn a mana stone from every mission, so it's like hitting two birds with one stone. As he takes a sip of water, someone approaches and calls out his full name. The boy's name is Anton Frederick, apparently related to Coma. Anton mentions that Coma, his brother, had to suffer because of him. Russell sharply replies, "And what's wrong with that?" and asks if Anton's here for revenge. Anton laughs and says there's no point in coming here just to take revenge, and his friends laugh with him. He tells Russell to stop fooling himself and jokes that no one would bother avenging a worthless piece of trash like him. Anton adds that he'd rather crush him instead of seeking revenge. As he passes by, Anton deliberately bumps his shoulder into him, reminding him that they'll meet again in class. Russell remembers they have a class coming up and wonders why Anton is acting so smug about it. Then it hits him. That class is Practical Combat Magic Studies, where students are graded based on sparring matches against one another. The bad news, in his previous life, every time he faced Anton in that class, he'd been humiliated. He remembers Anton always defeating him in fire magic and looking down on him afterward, mocking him for his weak man of veins. Russell can't believe he foolishly forgot about that. He decides he needs to start preparing immediately. Better late than never. Suddenly, the system screen notifies him of a new mission to achieve the second circle by increasing his understanding of the attributes he currently possesses. That day, Russell spent every waking moment completing the assignments the professor had given him, working late into the night. The next morning, he brought a pile of papers to the professor's office to submit his work. The system displayed multiple notifications, one for each assignment, informing him that he'd completed his missions and would now receive his rewards. That evening, Russell returned to his dorm after a long day and decided to check his rewards. He looked at roughly 10 mana stones that the system had given him and wondered what to do with them. A growing doubt crept in as he picked them up. He wondered if the mana vessel inside his body could handle several mana stones at once without causing any side effects. In the end, he accepted his fate and decided to go for it. He told himself he'd just have to trust in the training he'd been doing for so long. A few seconds later, he threw all 10 stones into his mouth and chewed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly, mana erupted from the stones, and his body was engulfed in it. The glow intensified until the entire room was flooded with bright light. A burning sensation spread through him as his body began absorbing mana into his heart. Soon, it carved a pathway into his mana veins. Russell began forming a flow pattern to guide the mana, focusing it toward his heart. He was clearly in pain, but he endured it. Then he started wrapping the mana flow around his heart, sketching a new circle just like the first one he already had so he could reach the second circle. If he failed to do this correctly, his heart wouldn't be able to withstand it. He carefully drew the second circle, hesitating for a moment near the end. Afraid of making a mistake, but there was no turning back, he decided to finish it. The moment he focused and completed the circle, his veins began to absorb the surging mana. Russell refused to give up, no matter the consequences. There was no way he could achieve his dream of becoming a world-class mage without doing this. He promised himself he'd reach the second circle. Suddenly, a bright beam of light burst from his window. It looked like an explosion. Moments later, Russell woke up on the floor and realized he had done it. He'd succeeded. He had finally achieved the second circle. Mana now flowed freely through his body as he lay there exhausted. Suddenly, the system notified him that he had completed the mission and would receive his rewards. Apparently, his understanding of the elemental attributes had increased dramatically, meaning the power of all his elemental magic had also risen significantly. The next morning, Professor Hubert read through all the reports Russell had submitted. He gasped in astonishment, admitting that he couldn't believe Russell had managed to finish all those tasks in such a short time. Then, the professor told him there was one last question before he could grant him access, a question that was more fundamental than all the previous ones. The professor asked, which of the four structures that make up magic is the most important? The question caught Russell off guard, leaving him speechless. Professor Hubert noticed his silence and immediately regretted asking such a question, especially since he himself had only recently discovered the answer. To avoid confusing the boy, he quickly stood up and suggested asking something else instead. But Russell, who had been silent until now, began answering anyway. The professor was stunned by his confidence, shocked that he actually had an answer. Hubert stopped speaking and listened carefully. Russell finally replied that the most important structure in magic is the mental image of the person casting the spell. The professor hesitated, thinking deeply about the response, then asked why Russell believed that to be true. Russell paused for a moment before speaking. He said that magic is the manifestation of something into the real world through mana. Scholars divide this process into four distinct stages. The first stage is assimilation, where one learns the principles governing natural phenomena. The second stage is creating a mental image, where one imagines what has been learned within the mind. The third stage is construction, where formulas are built to manifest that mental image. The final stage is manifestation, where the spell comes into existence in the real world through those formulas. Russell added that understanding construction and manifestation can be learned through effort and study. But the mental image is something no amount of effort can guarantee. It depends on one's ability to break through personal limits and reach freedom of imagination through courage. That's what determines the true level of one's mental imagery. He stretched out his hands and conjured a flame to illustrate his point. He explained that he could choose to imagine that this flame was an arrow and picture it in his mind. If he did that, the flame would become a second circle spell, fire arrow. And just as he said, the flame in his hands shifted into the shape of an arrow. Then he added that he could also choose to imagine something entirely different. The flame would follow his imagination and transform into something else completely. He said he should never limit his mental image, because by breaking those limits, he could create something that didn't exist in this world. The professor listened intently, nodding in agreement with everything he said. Russell continued, saying that everything begins by understanding how the world ends and then twisting its rules to bring something beautiful to life. He extinguished the flame and finished his explanation with confidence. Professor Hubert, who had been listening the entire time, thought about how brilliant Russell sounded. He finally spoke, saying Russell had confirmed what he himself had long suspected. Smiling, the professor told him that the student library was now far too small a world for him. Suddenly, the system notified Russell that he had completed the mission. Obtain access to the first floor of the professor's library. His reward was 2 low-grade mana stones. Later that day, Russell entered the first floor of the professor's library. Even this single floor was vast, something he found fascinating. Compared to the student library, this one felt completely different. He quickly began browsing through the shelves and picked a few books to read. To him, these books felt far more practical than anything he'd ever had access to before. Then, suddenly, a woman entered the library and watched Russell from behind. She finally spoke to catch his attention, commenting that he was reading a very interesting book. Russell was startled by the voice. He hadn't realized anyone else was there. He quickly dropped the book and turned around. Strangely, he saw no one. It turned out the woman had somehow teleported in front of him, pointing for him to look ahead. She was wearing a witch's uniform, and he immediately recognized her. The woman smiled at him. It was Darius Snow White, the Lady of the Flame Tower. Russell quickly greeted her and introduced himself. He instantly felt uneasy in her presence, because she was someone who had reached the 8th circle, a level only a handful in the entire world had ever attained. Despite being over 80 years old, she maintained a youthful appearance by using an incredible amount of mana. She was the highest-ranked Tower Master among the Red Tower faction, known as the Tower of Flame. Darius was surprised that he recognized her. She pulled a giant lollipop out of nowhere, instantly putting him at ease, telling him there was no need to be so tense. Curious about how a student managed to gain access to the professor's library, she turned and asked him. Russell told her that Professor Hubert had granted him permission. Darius quietly exclaimed and asked, "Did a strict old man like Professor Hubert really let you use the library?" Russell smiled, realizing the professor could indeed be a bit uptight. She nodded, saying that made sense, and explained it was why he'd been studying something so interesting when she came in. Her eyes swept over him as she examined his mana, and she noticed his mana purity was extremely high, with a very stable distribution as well. Looking at him again, she muttered that it was rare to find someone like him. As she walked past him, she told him not to worry and to ease his tension, assured him that she wasn't there to lecture him or stand in his way. Russell bowed, once again, thanking her for her kind words. Suddenly, a bright light burst from the spot. She told him, "Grow to your fullest potential." But when he looked up again, she was gone. All that remained was the lingering glow she had teleported elsewhere. Russell stood there, stunned, staring at the space where she'd been. When it was over, Russell quietly left the professor's library, closing the door behind him, still shaken by the encounter. As he lingered in thought, a voice from behind called out, asking if it was really him standing by the door. Russell turned around, and there stood Anton and his gang. One of Anton's friends asked why Russell had just come out of the professor's library, sneering, "Who does he think he is?" Anton commented that it looked like Russell must have kissed up to one of the professors, but that wouldn't change the fact that he'd never amount to anything. The boys laughed as they walked away, and Anton told Russell to keep trying his best. As he turned to leave, he glanced back and said, it wouldn't help him anyway. Not long after, the students gathered in the academy's training field for real combat magic studies. The first person called down to the arena would choose another student as their opponent. The supervising professor usually picked the weakest student first, so that person could fight someone on their level. Suddenly, all eyes turned toward Russell. It seemed everyone expected his name to be called. He remembered that in his previous life, he had always been the first. Some nearby boys whispered jokes, saying Russell will be picked again because of his condition, Manhwa narrowing. One student immediately began pleading with Russell to pick him once his name was called, saying it would help boost his grades for the semester. Another told him not to choose that jerk, but to pick him instead. The professor noticed the growing commotion and told everyone to quiet down. He then began calling out the first name. Everyone whispered that it would be Russell, and laughter spread through the group. But to everyone's shock, the name announced was Anton Frederick. The students were stunned, wondering why Anton was chosen first. Anton strutted proudly toward the professor, thanking him for calling his name. But the professor replied that it was nothing compared to the support he received from the Frederick Trade Association. Russell's eyes narrowed. He had been expecting something like this. Anton stepped into the center of the arena and paused before calling out a name. He looked straight at Russell and said, "Come down here." Meanwhile, Professor Hubert received an unexpected visitor in his office, his former teacher. He said he would have appreciated a little notice before her arrival. The visitor, of course, was Darius Snow White. Taking a seat, she told him it was fine after all. It wasn't a big deal for a teacher to visit her student. Remembering the boy she'd met in the library, she asked if he had granted a student named Russell permission to use the faculty library. Hubert confirmed it right away, asking nervously if the boy had done something wrong. Darius told him he hadn't, but that she simply hadn't seen anything so rare and precious in a very long time. Hubert agreed, saying that Manhwa narrowing was already an uncommon condition even on this continent. But Darius called him an idiot, saying that wasn't what she was talking about at all. Her words shocked Hubert, who looked up immediately to see what she meant. Darius explained that Russell had actually managed to overcome his condition. Hubert asked what she meant by that, but Darius stayed silent for a moment, sipping her tea. When it became clear he wasn't getting it, she finally revealed the truth. The boy had reached the second circle. Hubert was genuinely stunned, wondering how that could even be possible. Meanwhile, back on the training field, the two boys took their positions and prepared to duel. Just before the match began, another system screen appeared before Russell. It notified him that his next mission was to win while training magic, and that he could earn lowest grade magic stones and a storage compartment capable of holding up to 40 kilograms. Russell was thrilled to learn about the storage compartment. After all, that kind of magic was normally reserved for the wealthiest mages. It allowed you to store objects safely, making it incredibly useful for keeping magic stones. As he was still thinking about it, Anton called out to him, sneering and calling him a bug. Anton asked if his body had frozen up in fear, then told him the only way he'd survive this match was to beg for mercy. Russell just laughed. Suddenly, Russell's entire body flared with energy as he asked Anton, "Are you talking to me?" Anton noticed the shift and wondered if what he was seeing was really what he thought. As the tension grew, the supervising professor told them both to step back into position so the match could begin. The professor remembered the spell Russell had just used and wondered if someone suffering from Manhwa narrowing could really have reached the second circle, but quickly dismissed the idea as impossible. The moment the duel began, Anton immediately unleashed a second circle spell called Flamethrower. A stream of fire shot straight toward Russell. Russell saw the flames rushing at him and reacted instantly, summoning a shield to deflect them. The fire slammed into the barrier and burst upward. Unable to break through, Russell held his ground, maintaining the shield as he withstood the blazing torrent. One of the supervising professors nearby was stunned by Russell's incredible reaction. The professor in charge of the match also watched in shock at his performance. Anton, who had been sustaining his stream of fire for quite some time, began to tire from holding his arms out. Shocked that Russell was able to endure such an intense attack. Suddenly, the flames sputtered out his body needed to regulate the mana he was losing, and Anton cursed under his breath as the fire ceased. Russell noticed the pause and immediately seized the opportunity. He had been expecting this. He cast a second circle spell known as Fire Arrow, launching it straight toward Anton, who had just stopped his assault. Anton was shocked to see him using Fire Arrow and quickly tried to counter. He began to wonder if Russell had really achieved the second circle, surrounding himself with a shield to block the arrow. The arrow struck the barrier, failing to pierce it, but Anton could feel its impact. He couldn't believe that a bug like Russell was putting up such a fight, still bracing himself behind the shield as the lingering flames crackled around him. Anton noticed something that made his eyes widen. Right in front of him, Russell had already conjured a second fire arrow. Without hesitation, Russell fired again, showing no mercy. The second arrow slammed into Anton's shield, giving him no time to recover. The officiating professor gasped and muttered if this was double casting. Another professor beside him corrected him, saying it wasn't true double casting, but rather that Russell's spell casting speed was so fast, it only looked that way. As they spoke, Russell conjured yet another fire arrow. Anton noticed this and scoffed, wondering if all Russell could do was make fire arrows. He quickly switched tactics, altering the structure of his shield. Using another second circle spell, he transformed it into a fire-resistant barrier. Russell saw the change and smiled. That was exactly what he'd been waiting for. Anton smirked, thinking he had it all figured out. All he had to do was wait until Russell burned through his mana, trying to break the fire-resistant shield, then strike back. But to Anton's surprise, Russell suddenly canceled his fire arrow and began chanting another spell. The flames vanished from his hand, replaced by a fierce gust of wind. Anton's eyes widened in alarm as he shouted his plan had just fallen apart. Russell cast another second circle spell, this time Wind Arrow, and fired it directly at Anton's shield. The arrow hit him squarely, knocking him backward. Anton was stunned that the bug had analyzed his defense mid-fight and adjusted his magic accordingly. A nearby professor's jaw dropped as he watched, wondering if this was really the same Russell he knew. Meanwhile, the crooked professor who had rigged the match in Anton's favor was drenched in sweat. Unable to believe what he was seeing, Anton groaned from the impact, losing control of his shield. The shock wave sent him skidding backward, nearly out of the circle. Rage flared in his eyes. He couldn't accept that some weakling was actually beating him. But before he could react, Russell stepped forward and began casting again. This time, Russell unleashed lightning magic. A bolt of electricity shot from his hand, striking Anton square in the chest and sending him flying further back. Anton's eyes rolled back as he screamed, his body convulsing from the electric surge. He tried to summon fire to defend himself, but he was far too weak. Russell didn't give him the chance to recover. He hit him again with another strike of lightning. The crooked professor who had sided with Anton began shouting in protest, claiming he didn't even recognize the kind of magic Russell was using and that the duel should be stopped immediately. Standing nearby, Professor Hubert told him to take a closer look at what was surrounding Russell's body, then decide for himself if it wasn't magic. The professor did and froze in disbelief. A bright aura surrounded Russell, shimmering like a knight's battle aura. Stammering, he said that Russell was channeling mana in the same way a knight used aura. Professor Hubert smiled proudly and said he didn't know how the boy had managed it, but clearly he had found a way out of his former curse. Meanwhile, Russell continued to pummel Anton into the ground. He finally stopped once Anton had left a crater in the training field. The students were utterly speechless, jaws hanging open in shock at the turn of events. The crooked professor stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. As he stood there dumbfounded, a voice beside him asked what he was waiting for. He turned quickly. Professor Hubert reminded him that he was supposed to announce the winner. The flustered man stammered before hurriedly declaring it. Russell Raymond is the winner. Because of the unexpected outcome, the professor awkwardly walked up to Russell, praised him stiffly, and told him he could leave. But Russell said it wasn't over yet. When the professor asked what he meant, Russell reminded him of the class rules. According to them, unless the winner voluntarily surrendered, he had the right to call out the next opponent. Anton's friends gasped in horror. They realized they were next in line to get beaten up. Russell immediately pointed at one of them and told him, "You're next." Suddenly, the system displayed another notification, a new mission to win the next magic duel with rewards including 2 lowest grade mana stones and bonus prizes for consecutive victories. Russell looked straight at the boy and told him to step into the circle. Later, Professor Hubert muttered to himself that Russell had gone on to win 14 duels in a row. Watching the matches, he concluded that the boy possessed incredible insight, and he couldn't help but feel proud that he had recognized Russell's potential long ago. Still, Professor Hubert couldn't help wondering how Russell had managed to progress so fast. He remembered every move he'd seen from him in the arena. Meanwhile, Russell received a notification he had completed his mission, and the storage compartment was now unlocked as a reward. The system informed him that from now on, all his rewards would automatically be placed into the compartment. He also gained a series of Monstones for every battle he'd won. But there was something else, a mysterious, unknown item the system had granted as an additional reward. Russell looked at the notification about the unknown item. Curious about what it could be, he summoned the compartment to check it out. Reaching inside, he rummaged through the items until he pulled something out. A kind of map marked with an X at one specific spot. Another notification appeared, a new mission. He had to travel to the location marked on the map and complete the assigned task there. The system informed him that guiding lights would appear once he neared the site to lead the way. The mission's reward was another unknown item plus 5 intermediate grade Mon, but there was also a warning. It would be best to attempt this mission only after reaching the third circle. Russell was shocked to read that the third circle. He remembered trying countless times in his past life, but never managing to reach that level. And now there was another problem. He had no idea where this mysterious place even was. The map offered no clear clues. He hurried to the professor's library, hoping to find something that might point him in the right direction. He dumped a stack of books onto the table, flipping through them in search of any hint. The first was titled Enmian Kingdom's Outer Territories. He skimmed through it eagerly, but nothing. He grabbed another, still nothing, then another, and another. After searching through dozens of books, he groaned in frustration. None of the locations matched the one on his map. Cursing under his breath, he left the library. Realizing he'd wasted too much time, he decided it was better to focus first on reaching the third circle. As he walked down the corridor, several students instinctively stepped aside, intimidated after witnessing his performance in the arena. Russell thought to himself that he had at least escaped ridicule and bullying. The only problem now, he was still a loner. While deep in thought, he heard someone call out from behind. Turning around, he saw Professor Hubert, who warmly asked if he could come by his office. Russell cheerfully agreed. Once inside, the professor mentioned that summer vacation was approaching. Pouring them both some tea, he asked Russell if he had any plans for the break. Russell said he didn't, at least not yet. Hearing that, Professor Hubert asked if he'd like to join him on a research project, which surprised Russell. The professor explained that depending on his contribution, he could even have his name listed as a co-author. Russell picked up the research paper and glanced at the picture printed on it and instantly recognized the place. The professor noticed his surprise and asked what he was thinking. Russell quickly apologized, then said that actually he did have plans for the summer. Hubert looked puzzled, pointing out that he just said he didn't. Russell handed him the book and explained that he planned to go to the place drawn on it. His eyes widened as he recognized the location's name, Maldiva. Sometime later, when summer vacation began, Russell set out on his journey to Maldiva. Sitting in the back of a carriage, he enjoyed the scenery through the window. Later, he summoned the compartment again, took out a mana stone, and popped it into his mouth. He muttered to himself that it would fill his stomach for the trip ahead, and promised that he'd reach the third circle before he arrived at Maldiva. Back at the academy, Professor Hubert couldn't shake the strange feeling about Russell's trip. What made it odd was that someone else was also headed to Maldiva. He realized that Daraya, his old mentor, was likely there at that very moment. Perhaps it was a good thing Russell was going too. Meanwhile, by the sea of Andy Mayan in Maldiva, Daraya was sunbathing on the beach, enjoying her vacation. She thought to herself that while this may have been her homeland, it never stopped being beautiful. Sipping her drink, she wondered how long it had been since her last real break. She remembered all the time she'd spent protecting the empire, giving lectures on magic, and training her students. The Lady Master reminisced about the time she used to teach her students about the numbers 9, 6, and 3. She conjured flames in her hands and explained that these 3 numbers held special meaning for mages. The children were struck by the depth of her knowledge and listened in complete silence. Daraya taught them that the number 9 symbolized completion, the path of one who walks the road of the 9th circle. The number 6 represented the stage of attainment, the struggle every mage endures to reach greatness as a grand mage. And the number 3 symbolized something different. It marked the beginning of solitude for a mage. She reflected quietly on what it meant to be alone as a magician. Then suddenly she remembered her encounter with Russell and wondered if the boy was doing well. She thought about how she had found him reading an advanced magic text, and a faint smile crossed her face. Meanwhile, Russell's carriage finally arrived at Maldiva, and the driver turned to tell him that they had reached their destination. The carriage driver waited for a while, noticing that Russell wasn't getting out. When he finally walked to the back to check on his passenger, he screamed in shock at what he saw. Sometime later, Russell was devouring food like a starving beast, tearing a hot dog apart with one hand while eating a loaf of bread with the other. A mountain of food sat in front of him. He remembered how much energy he'd burned trying to calm the raging Manhwa while forming his third circle. In a brief flashback, the carriage driver had found him unconscious and panicked, thinking he was dead as he tried frantically to wake him. Back in the present, Russell gulped down a drink, relieved that he had finally achieved the third circle. He slammed the empty cup onto the table and grinned. Reaching that level of magic was an incredible feat, and the fact that he'd managed to surpass the limit that had haunted him in his past life, all within just a few months of returning to the past, left him a ruck. He tossed a few coins on the table to pay for his meal and headed for the door. As he walked out, he muttered that he'd have to go beyond the third circle, far beyond. The system reappeared, showing him the mission tied to the mysterious map. It notified him to locate the site marked with the X and reminded him that the light will guide you once he took the bold step toward it. Russell looked at the map again and realized he had to find the place, but he didn't know the landscape. As he was still thinking about how to get there, he overheard a tour guide calling out to a group of men, saying he'd take them on the best tour around the Pompeii volcano with a special discount for today only. Moments later, Russell joined the group and followed the guide up a rocky trail. The guide explained that Pompeii had once been an ordinary mountain until it somehow transformed into a volcano. The reason, he said, was that a certain creature had taken up residence inside. There was only one being in the world that fit that description, the Red Dragon. Hearing this, Russell decided it was time to move on his own. Hanging back behind the tourists, he leapt off the cliff they were standing on. While the guide continued talking to the others, Russell dove off the edge, landing on the river below, and began walking across the water. He thought to himself that there might be a connection between this place and the reason he had been sent back in time. His growth, his missions, his rewards, all of it might be leading him to something greater. Following the map upward toward a waterfall, he reasoned that everything he had gone through might somehow be linked to the dragon that once lived here. As he studied the map, streams of light began to flow out from it, floating before his eyes. The glowing strands converged into a circular shape like an eye. Then, a single beam of light broke away from the map and started moving forward. Russell immediately realized this must be the guiding light the system had mentioned. It drifted over the river, leading the way straight through the waterfall. Russell smiled faintly, realizing his mission's location lay behind the falls. He quickly cast a wind spell wind arrow to slice through the cascade and create a clear path. Then, without hesitation, he jumped through the opening to avoid getting soaked. Once inside, he landed on a rock and discovered a lava cave right behind the waterfall. He remembered how the system had warned him not to come here until reaching the third circle. But he saw no monsters or creatures around. It made him wonder why there had been a warning in the first place. He pressed on carefully through the cave, watching every step. Before long, he came across several stone pillars, signs that someone, or perhaps some group, had once lived here long ago. Placing his hand on one, he wondered how old it was. Then, from the corner of his eye, something caught his attention. The guiding light had stopped right in front of a strange door. Russell approached the door cautiously, curious about what lay beyond. But as he got closer, his senses suddenly tingled a deep, instinctive warning. He froze, realizing he'd momentarily forgotten one of the most important lessons from his mercenary days. When there are no monsters, no creatures, no sounds at all, it can only mean one thing. You've stepped into the territory of a powerful predator. Out of nowhere, a massive lizard creature appeared, towering over him. Russell leapt back just in time to dodge its snapping jaws. From a few meters away, he got a good look and recognized it instantly. It was a Komodo lizard monster. He remembered from his mercenary days that it was the kind of beast that took at least 2 full mercenary teams to defeat. Watching the creature advance, Russell realized the only thing he could do now was run. There was no way he could kill it. To slow it down, he decided to use lightning magic. He chose a second circle spell, lightning arrow, and began forming one. The Komodo lizard roared as it charged again. But Russell didn't flinch. He aimed the arrow right at its face and fired, hoping to stun it long enough to escape. The impact was explosive. The creature was electrocuted, its body convulsing as it froze in place. Russell grinned, relieved to have bought himself a little time. Without wasting another second, he sprinted straight toward the stone gate, where the light had stopped to reach the next part of his mission. But just as he was inches away from the door, 2 stone statues blocking the entrance crossed their staffs in front of him and declared in deep, echoing voices, "Prove you are worthy, through your mana. Russell was stunned clearly. These gatekeepers weren't going to let him through easily. At that moment, the Komodo lizard reached him, seemingly unaffected by the lightning strike from before. Russell glanced behind. No escape route in either direction. Thinking fast, he decided to do something reckless since his path was blocked. Turning sharply, he muttered that he'd just have to make his own way. Stretching out his hand, he summoned flames and hurled them straight at the beast. Suddenly, the stone gate behind him reacted. The gem embedded within it absorbed the mana Russell was releasing. The monster froze, staring at the glowing door in confusion. Instead of advancing, the Komodo lizard stopped dead in its tracks. Russell was just as startled, wondering why it had suddenly halted. The giant creature straightened up, towering nearly upright as Russell looked on in bewilderment. Then the two stone sentinels that had been blocking the gate lifted their spears and stepped aside. The same mysterious voice he'd heard before echoed again. "You have proven your worth." That meant he could enter. The crimson stone on the door gleamed brightly, its glow intensifying until it flooded the entire cave in brilliant red light. Moments later, Russell awoke with a throbbing headache in a completely different place. He blinked rapidly, scanning his surroundings. Everything had changed when he touched the ground. He realized it was made of ice, and he wondered how he could be standing on it when, just seconds ago, he'd been inside a lava cave. All around him was an ice cavern filled with towering, frozen statues. As he tried to make sense of it, he considered the possibility that he'd been transported here by teleportation magic. While still piecing things together, something else caught his eye. At the top of an icy staircase stood a strange magical horn bound by a chain of runes. As he studied it, the system reappeared before him. The screen notified him of a second mission to defeat all the ice golems in the area and pass the trial of fire. A noise from behind made him spin around. The statues he'd seen earlier were moving. They weren't statues at all, but golems now coming to life. Dozens of massive ice golems surrounded him, and he wondered if they seriously expected him to take on this entire horde alone. There was no time to waste. Russell immediately conjured fire magic in his palms. He cursed under his breath, realizing this was going to be brutal, but there was no other choice. He summoned a firebolt and fired it wildly at the nearest golem. The bolt ripped through the frozen cavern and struck the monster square in the chest. Since fire trumped ice, it should have done serious damage. Russell remembered that to destroy a golem, you had to crush its core. But when the firebolt hit, the creature barely flinched. If it could talk, it would have said, "Is that all you've got?" The attack only left a crack in its chest. It looked hopeless. Russell might end up as the golem's next meal. Frustrated, he muttered about how ridiculously cold the ice must be. If fire didn't work, he'd try something else. He began gathering wind magic in his hands. But something was wrong. The wind didn't respond. Startled, he realized his wind spells weren't working at all. Before he could think, one of the golems lunged, swinging a massive arm to crush his skull. Russell dodged and switched tactics, summoning lightning instead, but even that didn't appear. His eyes widened in horror. He was cooked. The golem's fist smashed into the ground where he'd just been. Thankfully, Russell managed to roll away just in time, sliding backward until his back hit a wall of ice. Panting, he replayed the earlier notification in his mind. Something about the trial of fire. Another golem charged at him, aiming to smash him flat against the wall. Russell jumped aside again, realizing the truth. He couldn't use any kind of magic except fire here. Trying to back away, he tripped over an icy rock and stumbled into a dead end. The golems surrounded him. The situation seconds away from turning catastrophic. Groaning from the impact, Russell felt blood trickle from his forehead. His vision blurred, but his eyes burned with determination. He summoned another firebolt, his body blazing with mana, and marched straight toward the golems. For the first time, he faced the challenge he'd in. The golems hesitated, watching as fire and mana enveloped his entire form. Then Russell unleashed 3 firebolts at once. The ice golems were caught off guard by the sudden barrage. They were too slow to dodge. The triple blast hit with explosive force, cracking the icy cavern apart. One golem's core was exposed from the blasts. Russell immediately fired again, another firebolt straight at the core, shattering the monster into shards. He turned to another and did the same, obliterating it completely. Gasping for air, he realized he had only taken down 2 so far. At this rate, he'd run out of mana long before he could finish the rest. Gritting his teeth, he tried to think. Another golem swung at him, forcing him to dodge and retreat to buy time to strategize. He thought quickly to shatter that solid ice shell in one go. He realized he needed to attack the same way knights shattered iron armor with a single decisive blow. To do that, he'd have to focus all his power into one point. In the end, he concluded he needed to pack greater mass into every volume of his spell. It wouldn't be a simple spell. So, he backed up to gain some space enough to cast something that complex. Once he made some distance between himself and the golems, he began the incantation. He started by forming a fire arrow, then applied an amplification formula to make it larger and heavier. To make the bolts replicate, he layered on a replication formula. Everything went smoothly. Multiple fiery arrows appeared before him. Finally, there was one more thing to make the attack truly dense. He had to merge them. If he could fuse all 5 arrows into one, it would carry the combined power of them all. Russell began using the magical compression formula, fusing them between his palms and forcing them into a single, blazing mass. Suddenly, one of the ice golems lunged toward him, its massive fist raised. For a second, it looked like he was the one about to be merged into the frozen floor. Russell screamed, begging the arrow to merge faster so he wouldn't die. At the very last moment, he released the fused arrow. The resulting explosion was massive. The blast was so powerful, it stopped all the golems in their tracks. One of them was hit square in the chest, leaving a gaping hole right where its core had been. Russell stumbled back as the shattered golem collapsed to the ground. He stood tall, holding his newly forged weapon, Blaze Lance. Once again, his eyes glowed like a dragon's. The system displayed a notification. His understanding of fire elements had transcended beyond limits. Russell grinned, agreeing with the message. He could feel it. The strength surging through him was close to something from the 5th circle. Gripping the lance, he noticed that just holding it drained his energy rapidly. Determined not to waste it, he made his move. The remaining golems charged, showing no fear of his brilliant weapon. Russell unleashed his attack straight from where he stood, burning through the cores of 3 golems instantly, then moving on to the next and the next. He counted only 4 left. Without hesitation, he pressed forward to finish what he'd started. He shattered one core effortlessly, then slashed through the second, obliterating it as well. Now only 2 remained. As he counted, one of the golems attacked from above, trying to crush him, but he dodged easily. Leaping upward, he retaliated in midair, slicing the monster clean in half for its insolence. With that one down, Russell panted heavily. His mana nearly depleted, but he refused to stop until every single one was gone. The final golem prepared a long-range attack, hurling enormous ice boulders his way. Russell deflected them with his lance, though a few still grazed him. One solid hit would have killed him outright, if not for his defense. By now, he had only 1 breath of mana left, and the blaze lance began to dematerialize in his hands. He clenched his teeth and steadied himself. If this was his last ounce of strength, then he'd use it all in one strike. Raising the fading weapon, he decided to throw the lance. It was his final critical blow, and if he missed, that would be the end. When the monster drew close enough, he hurled it with all his might. The blazing spear pierced through its icy armor and struck its core dead center. Russell stood there, watching as the lance punched straight through the creature's chest, then burst out the other side. When he realized they were all gone, he collapsed to the ground in exhaustion. The system appeared once again, announcing that he'd completed the mission. His rewards: 1 low-grade mana stone, 3 lowest-grade mana stones, and 1 unknown object. The unknown object turned out to be something called the Forgotten King's Horn. It was the same mysterious horn Russell had seen earlier, bound in chains. Now it was wrapped in flames. The system screen displayed more information. It confirmed that this Forgotten King's Horn contained the fire essence itself. The horn began to emit a brilliant light, flooding the entire ice cavern. The glow filled every corner of the chamber, though Russell was unaware of it. He had passed out from sheer exhaustion. The system displayed one more message. He needed to enter the thoughts of the Forgotten King to receive his reward. Sometime later, Russell awoke in a strange place. In this dimension, he found himself bound in chains, struggling to understand where he was. The system appeared again, explaining that he had obtained the unknown object known as the Forgotten King's Horn, fire essence, and that he must enter the thoughts of the Forgotten King to claim his reward. Looking at the chains, Russell muttered that this felt less like a reward and more like torture. Suddenly, a deep, echoing voice, the Forgotten King himself, spoke. The voice declared that it would bestow upon him something called the King's Fragment. The horn materialized before him, blazing with fire. Its sharp tips slowly turned toward him, and Russell's eyes widened. It was about to impale him, and just as he feared, it did. The horn drove straight into him, and he screamed in agony. It was clear now, the chains existed only to stop him from escaping. The sharp end of the horn pierced deep into his flesh, releasing a torrent of energy inside him. The surge was so overwhelming that it felt like he was about to explode. Russell cried out at the top of his lungs, consumed by unbearable pain. The voice continued, telling him to use the power for something, but Russell could no longer hear it through the pain. His entire body was burning, overloaded with mana. Behind him, a massive dragon appeared, its presence radiating the aura of the forgotten king himself. Moments later, Russell's body washed up on a beach, carried there by the tide. He jolted awake, groaning as every inch of him ached. Disoriented, he tried to figure out what was happening and where he was. The architecture around him suggested he was still in Maldiva, but his thoughts were hazy and his memory was slipping. The system notified him that he had consumed the forgotten king's horn and had reached his limit. The message continued. His overflowing mana had been stored, and his intermediate understanding of flame attributes had now evolved into an advanced understanding. Russell clenched his fist and tried to activate his mana to confirm it. Instantly, a tremendous surge of energy burst from his body, far greater than anything he'd ever experienced before. Shocked, he realized he was now dangerously close to reaching the fourth circle. He looked around, wondering if this immense power was really coming from him. Then he recalled the treatment he'd endured while chained, but smiled, knowing the rewards had been worth the pain. Suddenly, a familiar voice behind him said, "It's nice to see you here." He turned, and standing there was the grand Miss Dariah Snow White, casually dressed, which startled him. She invited him to a seaside tavern, explaining that she had sensed a sudden burst of mana and came to investigate only to find him there. Russell thanked her as she handed him a drink. Smiling, he admitted he hadn't expected to see her in a place like this. The master scanned him with her eyes, noting that he had almost reached the fourth circle in such a short time, and that his mana had become far more pure than before. As they chatted, Russell asked the tower master what had brought her to Maldiva. Dariah told him that Maldiva was her hometown, though very few people knew that. Russell was surprised, asking if he'd heard correctly. She confirmed it with a nod, saying that was why she returned here every summer. Curious in turn, Dariah asked what had brought him to Maldiva. Russell hesitated, deciding it was too early to tell her the full truth. Finally, he offered a simple excuse. He'd come to see more of the world. The tower master smiled, accepting his answer, but thought to herself that she should probably test the boy's abilities. She decided to act, asking if he'd mind helping her with something. She saw his confusion. Snapping her fingers, she cast a spell suddenly. Flames swirled around Russell, wrapping him in a black cape. He immediately recognized the flame tower's insignia embroidered on it and wondered why she'd given it to him. The master told him not to worry. This was simply part of the task she wanted to assign him. A system window appeared before his eyes, notifying him of a new mission. Pass Miss Dariah Snow White's test. He was to assist her in fighting off the human trafficking ship pirates near Maldiva port to complete the test. The reward, an intermediate grade mana stone. Dura explained that Endymion completely forbids slavery, which was why slave trading ships were never allowed to dock at their ports. Unfortunately, there were still people who ignored those laws. She told him that a group of men was trying to bring their ship near Maldiva, and she wanted his help dealing with them. That evening, the two set off together in a small boat. Dariah told him she could handle the mission alone, but there was a catch. The plan required rescuing the victims as well as seizing the ship. Russell quickly grasped the implication that meant they need to fake an attack to distract the enemy while saving the captives. She praised his quick thinking as they continued to cross the dark waves. Russell pondered deeply. He knew that if the Lady of the Flame Tower asked for help, 100 mages would drop everything and come running barefoot if they had to. So if she was asking him in particular, it wasn't because she needed him. It was because she wanted to test him. Soon, they reached the ship they were looking for. Before stepping off the boat, Dariah warned that what would happen next might be too much for him to handle. She explained that he'd have to accept it because the path of a guardian was never smooth or noble. Apparently, this was just another fate of mages. After finishing her words, she stepped lightly to the edge of the boat and levitated toward the ship. She told him she would draw their attention and make it look like an attack, giving him the perfect window to save the kidnapped victims. Russell watched nervously as the Lady of the Flame Tower rose into the air beside the ship. She ascended higher, stopping once she'd reached a comfortable height above it. "This should be high enough," she said calmly, and then activated her mana. The night sky exploded with a bright, blinding light that engulfed the ship. "Go help the people," she shouted to him. The pirates panicked at the sudden glare. Convinced they were under attack, they rushed to the deck, scrambling to ready their giant crossbow, aiming it at the Lady of the Flame Tower. Several men grabbed smaller side crossbows, preparing to defend the ship with everything they had. Their captain gave the order, shouting for his men to fire at the light above the ship. A volley of arrows shot through the air, aimed straight at the glowing aura overhead. Inside the blinding light, Daria smiled, faintly amused by their pitiful attempt to hit her. One of the pirates cursed loudly when he realized their arrows couldn't even reach the master. With a flick of her wrist, Daria formed a sphere of lava in her hands and hurled it toward the ship, splitting it into several molten fragments as it struck. She spoke calmly. Let's see if they're as skilled as they are bold. The fragments of molten rock landed across the deck, igniting small fires everywhere. The pirates panicked at the sight, one of them stomping frantically to put the flames out, but it was useless. Suddenly, a fiery hand emerged from one of the flames and grabbed the man's leg. It wasn't mere fire at all. It was a fire golem. The man screamed as he struggled against the small creature clinging to him. One by one, each ember of fire around the ship transformed into tiny fiery dwarfs, each wielding blazing weapons. The men surrounded the fiery creatures, completely unsure how to deal with them. These were special creations of Daya, the dwarfs of Bunningwood. As the terrified pirates hesitated, one overconfident man stepped forward with his axe, convinced he could handle them. Meanwhile, Russell had climbed aboard the ship, leaping over the rail while the men were distracted. The overconfident pirate barked for his comrades to move, boasting that they had nothing to fear. Russell watched closely as the man approached one of the golems, raising his axe to strike. The little creature only looked up at him with innocent, glowing eyes. The pirate swung hard, splitting the golem clean in half. But a moment later, the golem began to mend itself, its molten body sealing back together. It didn't look pleased. Russell watched, fascinated. It was his first time seeing such creatures in person. The golem shape shifted, wrapping around the man's legs like liquid fire. In seconds, it fully constricted him, igniting his body in a burst of flames. The transformation was so fast that Russell could hardly believe what he was seeing. The other pirates froze, horrified as their companion burned alive before their eyes. Snapping back to focus, Russell realized this was no time to stand around and watch. He slipped away, heading down a set of stairs leading below deck. Below the deck was a massive prison compartment, clearly where the captives were being kept. A guard stationed there heard the chaos above and shouted, wondering what was happening. One of the prisoners cried out, "The navies here were saved," his voice full of hope. Their guard slammed his weapon against the bars, barking for silence. He told them it didn't matter what was happening above. None of them would ever escape. The frightened men fell silent. "You hear me?" he growled. Just then, Russell placed his hand behind his neck, deciding it was time to knock him out. A bolt of lightning erupted from nowhere and struck the overweight guard squarely in the back. One of the prisoners, seeing their unconscious captor, gasped and asked if Russell was there to rescue them. Russell smiled and said he was, and advised them to stay put until all the pirates were gone. The man dropped to his knees, thanking the gods for answering his prayers. Russell looked around, trying to gauge how many people were crammed into the small holding area. Then something caught his eye and his expression darkened. In one of the cells, he saw a young boy, barely 10 years old, huddled in a corner. The realization hit him hard. The pirates were even selling children as slaves. Rage burned in his eyes. "You filthy bastards," he muttered through gritted teeth. Moments later, a group of pirates rushed into the prison area, spotting Russell immediately. They froze when they saw their unconscious comrade on the ground, then drew their swords, shouting that the ship had been invaded. One of them barked orders to catch the intruder. Already seething with anger over the kidnapped child, Russell glared at them and said coldly, "Actually, I'll be the one arresting you." Lightning crackled around his hands as he summoned a chain of thunder, a second circle spell called Chain Lightning. The bolt lashed out, bouncing between the three men and electrocuting them all in an instant. Their bodies convulsed before collapsing into unconsciousness. One of them managed to stammer that their captain would make him pay, but Russell cut him off mid-sentence with another jolt of electricity. Russell continued searching the rest of the prison section. He stepped into a dark cell and frowned. "What's with this one?" he asked aloud. A voice from inside called back, asking if he was a mage from the flame tower. Russell conjured a small orb of light in his hand to see better and froze at what he found. Inside the cell were several elves. The male elf stepped closer to the bars, repeating his question. Was he a mage from the flame tower? Russell realized the question was prompted by the emblem on his cloak. He told the elf he wasn't officially a member yet, but the elf scoffed and said flatly, "Whatever you say, it doesn't matter." The elf stood before the gate, unimpressed, and demanded that Russell open the door already. Russell sighed. Internally, it was obvious he was going to open it, but he couldn't help wondering why this guy was so irritating. Then again, elves were famous for their pride. He studied the man's face, debating whether to just leave them there. Suddenly, another voice came from deeper inside the cell, a soft but commanding tone. A female elf stepped forward, telling the male to mind his manners. The other male elves gasped at the sound of her voice, calling her Elio. She tried to stand, and the others quickly helped her to her feet. Elio told them that Russell was no ordinary human. As she approached the gate, she explained that his mana was pure like the light of a setting sun. Apparently, he emitted what she called the scent of spirits. She smiled gently at him. The elves around her were stunned by the claim that the mage wasn't human. The talkative elf asked Elio what she meant, and Russell himself was equally shocked. The scent of spirits, he thought, confused. The elves began murmuring among themselves. How could a human possibly emit a spirit's aura? Even Russell awkwardly started sniffing himself, trying to catch the supposed spirit scent she mentioned. While he was doing that, the talkative elf called out to him again, begging Russell to save them. Then, to his surprise, the elf bowed deeply. One by one, the others followed his lead, pleading for help. The sight made Russell uneasy. He'd heard that elves were proud and haughty. Yet, one sentence from a female elf had changed everything. He glanced at her, wondering if she might actually be a high elf. After a moment, he began heating the lock with fire to melt it open. As he worked, Elio called him guardian and asked if he had already defeated the pirates and the bosses. Russell blinked. The bosses? He wondered what she meant. Meanwhile, in another room of the prison deck, a man in knight's armor stepped in and saw the unconscious guards on the floor. Back in the cell area, Elio continued, explaining that the bosses were stronger foes, far more dangerous than the common pirates. She said they were tougher than her own warriors who were highly skilled in magic. At the same time, the armored knight noticed the trail of bodies and the open cell door. A sly smile crept across his face as he imagined what he'd do to the intruder. Up on deck, the pirates were still struggling against Aria's fiery golems. Their captain watched from above, trying to stabilize the ship. Once he managed, he drew his sword and charged below deck, eager to join the fun. In a blur, he decapitated several fire golems. In a single sweep, they wouldn't be regenerating from those hits. When the fight ended, he mocked his men for struggling against such a light attack. A bright aura flared around him, clear proof that he was a knight. The pirates cheered as their captain joined the fray, shouting up at Daria that her end had come. The Lady of the Flame Tower merely watched with amusement, intrigued that they had actually managed to destroy her fiery creations. She descended gracefully from her height, landing softly on the ship's deck to see things for herself. Every eye turned toward her, the pirates stunned by her sudden arrival. The captain grinned smugly, saying she had a lot of guts to come down here alone. Daria chuckled and replied playfully, "So, you must be the captain." The man nodded proudly, introducing himself as Don Click. Daria's eyes scanned him from head to toe, his body, his stance, and his weapon. She noticed the shimmering aura surrounding him. That meant only one thing. He was once a knight. What's a former knight doing on a pirate ship? She asked. Don laughed loud and arrogant. Tell me, does a knight's honor feed you or pay your taxes? He let out a booming laugh and admitted that the Click brothers made far more money in the slave trade. Growing bored of talk, he raised his sword and lunged, declaring that he'd tear the witch apart. In the blink of an eye, he closed the distance and swung, but the Lady of the Flame Tower glided backward effortlessly, his blade cutting only air. Meanwhile, below deck, a massive slash tore through the wall of the prison hold. As Elio tried to warn Russell about the danger of the bosses, he turned just in time to see the wooden wall splitting apart. The cut detonated into a loud explosion, blowing debris everywhere. Russell staggered back, raising a magical shield to protect himself from the blast. Through the smoke stepped the second Click brother, the ship's vice captain. With a mocking tone, he remarked that Russell had actually managed to block his strike. Drawing his sword, he advanced slowly. As he approached, he realized Russell must be a mage. At the same time, Russell recognized that the man was using aura, something only knights could wield. The system chimed in with a new mission. Win your first battle against a duelist. It also warned that this would be a difficult fight. Elio's face tensed. She could sense the knight's power. She urgently told Russell to be careful, explaining that the second Click brother was the ship's vice captain, extremely dangerous. The knight drew his oddly shaped sword with a grin. You might be a mage, he said, but you're still just a kid. Advancing confidently, he sneered, asking why Russell had only knocked out the pirates instead of killing them. You should have finished them while you had the chance, he said coldly. Let me show you how it's done. Russell steadied his breathing and activated his own aura of mana. He quickly reasoned that fire magic would cause too much collateral damage in this wooden ship, so he switched tactics. Lightning magic would be perfect against an opponent wearing metal armor. He gathered his energy and unleashed a lightning bolt, followed by several more in rapid succession. The vice captain reacted instantly, moving his blade in an elegant motion to block. Before the bolts could strike him, he slashed the wooden floor, sending shards of debris flying upward to intercept the incoming lightning. The vice captain actually praised Russell's quick thinking, noting that he'd realized the sword and armor would conduct electricity. But then, instead of dodging the crackling lightning bolts, the vice captain charged straight into them, grinning as he told Russell there was something he didn't understand. Russell noticed that the stray lightning bolts sparking around the knight weren't affecting his armor at all. He kept firing bolt after bolt, but the man didn't even flinch. As the new wave of lightning streaked toward him, the vice captain kept advancing, sneering that such attacks wouldn't work. When the bolts hit his blade, they simply dissipated, the iron sword harmlessly absorbing the current instead of conducting it. Inside his shield, Russell's eyes widened in disbelief. How could a sword not conduct electricity? The vice captain closed the distance, swinging his blade down hard onto Russell's barrier. The strike hit with a thunderous clang, but the shield held at least at first. Then the knight slowly pulled his sword back, and Russell saw something alarming. A deep crack spreading where the strike had landed. That sword was no ordinary weapon. As Russell realized this, the fractured points suddenly split open. Up on deck, Don Click lunged at the Lady of the Flame Tower with lightning speed, attempting to cleave her in two. His sword struck true, or so he thought, only for her body to burst into flames. It had been nothing more than a decoy, which exploded into a shower of fire. When the flames dispersed, Darius stood unharmed ahead of him, breathed in fire. Don hissed through his teeth, irritated but impressed. "A clever witch, aren't you?" he muttered. Darius said nothing at first, her burning aura flickering in silence. Finally, she spoke. "Tell me, was your brother a knight as well?" Don smirked proudly, admitting that his brother was indeed a knight, though, he added. "Not as great as me." As they spoke, the flames swirling around Darius shifted, forming into another flame dwarf. Don chuckled. "That trick again?" he taunted. Darius smiled faintly. "No," she replied. "This time it'll be a little different." Don's grin faded. He frowned, asking what she meant, when suddenly more flame dwarfs erupted from the deck itself. They marched toward him, weapons blazing. Don's eyes darted around. "What the hell?" Darius finally answered, her voice calm. "The more of them you cut down, the more they multiply." Within moments, Don found himself facing nearly a dozen fiery dwarfs. These weren't her earlier creations. They were her elite conjurations, the dwarfs of Hellfire, born from her personal magic. She watched him fight them off with a look of deadly satisfaction. Don's confidence began to crack as he realized he was outnumbered, though his reflexes were still sharp. He fought fiercely, cleaving through wave after wave, but more kept coming. Then, as he stole a quick glance at her, it hit him. He finally recognized that face, that aura. She wasn't just any mage. She was the Witch of the Flame Tower herself. Meanwhile, below deck, blood had already been spilled. After his shield shattered, Russell found himself gasping in pain, blood dripping down his chest. The vice captain blinked. Russell had vanished from his sight. He turned quickly and spotted him standing to the side, barely holding himself upright. How did he dodge my strike from that range? He wondered. Russell steadied himself, clutching his bleeding chest. The knight was certain his blade had connected. It should have cut the boy in half, but when he looked closely, he noticed something strange. A faint aura glimmered around Russell's body. He realized Russell was reinforcing his physique with magic, essentially cloaking himself in mana. Russell kept the aura active, both to boost his physical abilities and to heal his wounds. The vice captain smirked, thinking the effort pointless to him. His opponent was nothing more than a rat caught in a trap. Watching from behind the bars, clenched her hands, sympathy written across her face. Russell's breathing grew heavy. He pressed one hand against the wall to steady himself, whispering under his breath that he knew something about knights. He remembered meeting one long ago in his previous life, a knight so ruthless he had massacred an entire mercenary band just because one of them had brushed his shoulder. Russell had been one of the last survivors, gravely wounded until a stranger appeared. That stranger had been a mage. The man conjured a barrier between them and the knight, enduring a storm of blows. Eventually, the mage subdued the knight, but only by using a secret technique. Drawing from that memory, Russell began forming another shield, just like that mage had done. The vice captain charged again, slashing to break through as he had before. As he swung, Russell recalled every detail of that old battle and decided to replicate the same technique. The knight's blade crashed down with brutal force, shattering the barrier once again. But something was different. Behind the broken layer was another. Russell had used the technique of stacking one shield over another, a double barrier. The first broke, but the second held firm. The vice captain stepped back, expecting his attack to have crushed Russell completely. But to his shock, the young mage was unharmed. Russell seized the opening. He quickly cast a second circle wind spell wind arrow and fired it straight into the knight's chest, catching him completely off guard. The impact of Russell's attack was so powerful that it hurled the knight clear across the room. His head slammed into the wall with a dull thud, followed by a groan of pain as blood trickled from his mouth. Russell staggered slightly, still weak from the wound in his chest. Though his body had mostly healed, the pain lingered. He wondered if he'd lost too much blood. He quickly finished melting the heated lock and freed the elves. As they stepped out, they thanked him sincerely for saving their lives. Russell urged them to follow him out of the chamber so they could escape the ship together. But then, a furious voice echoed behind him. The vice captain. "You little brat," he snarled, rising to his feet once more. The previous hit hadn't kept him down for long. His face was twisted in rage. He said, "You should have aimed for my head when you had the chance." Russell froze, shocked that he was still alive. He'd copied the technique exactly as the mage who once saved him. But somehow, the knight had survived. That didn't matter now. He quickly turned to Elio, telling her to take the prisoners and lead them to the upper deck where they'd be safe. The vice captain laughed mockingly and said, "You got time to play hero. How cute. You think you can save the slaves?" Before Russell could answer, the knight moved like a flash of light. In the blink of an eye, he was already in front of him. Russell's reflexes kicked in, and he summoned a shield just in time. The knight's blade crashed against it, shattering the first layer, but not the second. "I won't give you a chance to counterattack this time," the knight said coldly, raining blow after blow on him. Every new shield Russell conjured was shattered within seconds. Russell had no choice but to keep stacking barrier after barrier, enduring each brutal hit. He realized his only option was to stall.